Video number 2, the testimony, Christian experience a paradox. This is the second half of my testimony, the backstory leading up to my deliverance. When I was a child, I spoke as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. 1 Corinthians 13, verse 11. When I was a kid, things were chaotic. When I was born into a family that was already blended. My parents had been married several times before I came into the world, and they were older. My parents had gone through things that I didn't know about until later in life, which puts a little perspective on my story. However, the things that I'm going to describe are not for immature ears. They're not for those who are not ready to work on themselves, work on their position in life, work on the things that have caused them grief. So I will say this, if you're not ready for things that make you uncomfortable, turn this story off now, because I'm not going to go gentle. I'm going to speak the truth. As far back as I remember, and I remember a lot, I remember the traumatic things that happened to me. My dad, being a military man, taught me how to swim by throwing me in a lake at 1 year old. And what I remember was my mom screaming and saying she's going to drown. And my dad saying, "It's fine, leave her be." And all my mom did was scream. There was no action. At 2 years old, I remember my dad kicking and punching my mom, busting through the doorways, and me throwing myself on the ground and biting his ankles and saying, "I teched you, mommy." And watching my mom cry, watching my mom play her record player over and over again, singing the same songs. At 4 years old, things changed drastically. My older sibling takes me to a local park, and I'm held in the bathroom against my will by a 16-year-old boy who rapes me. That same summer, my dad leaves my mom and tells her that he's found someone else. And at that time, no one protected my womanhood. No one protected the sanctity of my womanhood. I was 4 years old. At 5, my dad is remarried, living with a new person. And she introduces us to her sister and her brother-in-law, who at the time has been molesting his own children and starts molesting me. So from the ages of 5 through 10, not only was I sexually abused, I had already seen domestic violence, intimate partner violence, physical violence. And this becomes the norm, where individuals in the neighborhood are manifesting sexual deviant behavior around me. My cousins were manifesting sexual deviant behavior around me all the time. In fact, we were left unattended so often in the mountains, on camping trips, and at family members' houses that sexual activity among family members was the norm. I started running away when I was 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 years old. And I knew how to move around to where people couldn't see me, but I could see them. And things were going on that were unfortunate. Drinking, drugging, sexual deviant behavior, suicidal behavior, fighting, arguing, physical violence, threats. And then I started being shifted from home to home. And in the interim, I had attended vacation Bible school. But that was only the beginning of sorrows for me, watching my family fight and argue and do things that were inappropriate, which I thought was normal. And then being left unattended with people that were sexually deviant. So right after I was born, my parents partied a lot. They drank a lot. They went out dancing and doing things that adults do. But the children were always in tow, and the children were left either with someone at the party or left with other children, which was the normal. And things went on. So during 2 years old, 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old, I saw every type of deviant behavior there was and being left unattended. At one point, I shaved my ankles off with razors, and my sister burnt 5 pounds of sugar and chocolate on the stove, and I burned both of my hands on the stove, climbing on top of the stove, only to get screamed at and then left unattended. And then I was hit by a car at age 7. Age 8, age 9, there was more sexual deviance between family members and siblings and things that went on that were abnormal that I thought was normal. After the little visit to vacation Bible school, my immediate family, including my sibling and the extended family, my stepmother's sister and the brother-in-law and the children also started attending church. But the sexual deviance was even worse than one could imagine. And the individual that was hurting me and his own children have lived within 150 yards of the church for 45 years. And this has gone on for years and years of the silence of myself and the silence of his own children. And it exploded a few years ago, but that's a different story. But by the time I was 10 years old, my dad started attending seminary and was going to become a pastor. But the deviance that I had witnessed was so deep. There was poaching of animals, family incest, partying and drinking, me being shifted around. I lived with my sister. I lived with my dad's friends in the same state or different states. I lived with my mom, and my mom was a heavy drinker. She could drink a bottle of CLC, 7 and 7, a bottle of Jack Daniels, and smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day and party with her friends, which were males. And eventually the males ended up touching me, and which leads to another side of the story where my mom worked for elites and she cleaned their houses, and she would have me strip naked and clean their houses while she stood in the other room and drank and smoked and would pocket the drugs that I found in these elites' homes. And I'm not exactly sure what was going on there, but one could only imagine, because there was a naked child running around cleaning and bending over under beds and vacuuming. And eventually at one point I met a famous golfer who showed me how to vacuum, and I was 9 years old. I was bending over in front of this full-grown man, and one of his employees ended up hurting me extremely bad. And my mom set the whole thing up. So she was sexually grooming me, and I didn't even know it. I didn't even know what that meant till later on in life. And then there were the family members that were codependent and covert narcissists enough to where they thought I was just out of control. I was a bad kid and I was being shifted around and needed someone to take care of me. I needed someone to babysit me. because I was the problem child, because they didn't want me around. And it was because I was seeing things that they knew was wrong, but my behavior was reflecting their behavior, which in turn was a circle of deviance because I was running away and I was sneaking out. I started to smoke cigarettes at a very early age and drink. I could outdrink all the adults by the age of 12. And it was unbearable for me. And at the same time, it was incomprehensible what I was seeing. And of course, there's always two sides to every story. And in my case, there's 5 sides to every story. Because I had a bio mom, a bio dad, a stepmom, a stepdad, a foster mom, a foster dad, and then multiple different instructors and teachers at a haunted orphanage in Denver, Colorado. And also a prison warden before I was 17. And a sheriff at a jail when I was 11. Plus being shifted around to 10 different schools and never gaining my high school diploma. I didn't get my high school diploma until I was in my early 20s and didn't have a driver's license till I was in my mid-20s. Things were quite out of control for me. And putting all of that in perspective, for a kid, it was quite mind-numbing. My life was numb. I didn't talk. I didn't talk about my feelings. I didn't have a lot of emotions. My parents were military-minded and put things back. Listen to me. Don't say anything. You don't know what you're talking about. Be seen and not heard. And I would get my hair cut off. I was the boy my dad never had. And so by the time I was 15, I had snuck out. I had smoked cigarettes. I had tried marijuana. I had been molested. I had sex with people that were family members that should have never happened. And things were quite out of control. I was shifted around. We went on trips. I ended up with thousands of tick bites and being stung by hundreds of bumblebees and being very sick. I had strep throat and tonsillitis at least 6 times a year, and I was called the problem child. I would go to school and end up in the nurse's office all day with a high fever because I was told if you puke, you're going to school. If you have a fever, you're going to school. I have to go to work and you're going to school. And there was an instance of physical abuse that was so bad where one of my siblings and my stepmother beat me so bad in tandem that they beat me black and blue from the back of my neck down to the back of my legs, down below my knees. And I had black and blue handprints all the way down my back. And at that time, I was sick with Lyme disease so bad and being stung by bees that my body just shut down after the beating and I couldn't move. I couldn't talk. And it was absolutely horrible. And my stepmother would come in the room and give me aspirin. And that was during the time of Reye syndrome, where if you give aspirin to children, they could die. And so I was probably suffering from encephalitis and physical trauma that the police should have been called. I was allowed to sit at the table as a child and read my Bible and recite scripture. I wasn't allowed to go to children's houses and have sleepovers. I wasn't allowed to have any kids at the house. And this was until I was 15, which included the parsonage when my dad graduated from theological seminary. We ended up in a parsonage in a small town where I had already been running away. And so I just kept running away. And of course I was becoming a teenager and I wanted to be free. And it ended up being a really bad situation where my dad punched me in the face and gave me a black eye and a fat lip and I ran away. And my option was to go back home because the authorities were called or go to a foster home. And I said, I can't go back there, so send me to foster care. And that was to my detriment because when I went to foster care, it was on a buffalo ranch and I was of course, running away. And the first moment I had the opportunity to run away, I ran away at the ranch and ended up being raped by one of the farmhands. And then shortly after that, running away in another state and running away completely from all of the abusers around me. And the further I went, the worse it got. And so I ran away from the orphanage as a runaway. I ran away from my parents' house. I ran away from my mom's house in another state in the middle of the mountains, and where there were mountain lions and serial killers at the time. A lot of people went missing. And so I was very fortunate because I was hitchhiking across country as a young girl, being shifted around. My dad would put me on a Greyhound bus and send me someplace, or put me on a plane and send me someplace by myself. And I'm this skinny little twerpy looking girl getting hurt by people. And then my mom would do it in the reverse, and she would send me away. I would hitchhike, and at one point I showed up at her house in the middle of the mountains in Colorado by myself, and she just said, "What are you doing here?" and called the highway patrol on me, and they told me to go away. They just told me to leave. And I did. And so I was completely out of control because I was trying to get away from the narcissism and the manipulation and the abuse and the sexual violence that I was putting up with, and the intimate partner violence of family members abusing each other and abusing me, and then blaming me for their behavior. And eventually it was so out of control that my stepfather, who was a 33rd degree Mason, was also molesting his own children before he got into a relationship with my mother, and ended up touching me. And my mom was inclined to think that I was in love with my stepfather, but it was quite the opposite, that I didn't like anyone that I was around because they were always hurting me. And at one point I witnessed him punch my mom in the back and him get dragged off to jail. And these are all, mind you, military people that were in the Air Force and the Army and the Navy, and had gone through things that people can't imagine would give them trauma, but they would turn around and cause trauma for other people. And God had not quite stepped into my life yet, but I was out of control for many years after that.